Hello, everybody. Welcome to the January 24th occurrence of the Gateway API Gamma meeting. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, so everybody please be nice. As a reminder, this meeting is governed by an open agenda. Anybody can come and add a topic and we will discuss it. So I've pasted a link to the agenda here in the chat. So if you've got a topic you'd like to discuss that's not already there, then please feel free to add it. We'd love to hear from you. While you're there on the agenda, please go ahead and put your name in that top section for attendees. We'd like to know that you were found as interesting enough to spend your afternoon/evening here with us. So it's nice to just have a record of that. So do that if you will. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here, and we will get this agenda kicked off. We've got a couple of topics here, and I'm excited for the always riveting discussions that we have. So as is our custom, we'll start with a recap. So last week we discussed this PR about expanding GEP 1492, I believe, the Gamma GEP for HTTP route to support client or consumer routing config. I'll go ahead and open that here in GitHub. Just take a look. We're in pretty good shape here. It looks like I've got a couple of approvals here. We're just double checking a couple of comments, making sure they're resolved, and then we'll look for a gateway maintainer to do the honors and give the LGTM so that we can get this merged in. Does anybody present have an update or concerns about this PR?
No
I'm just
concerns.
gonna remember this one. We're just waiting for like one LGTM. We have.
Yeah, I think we meant to approve it last week, and then it just got lost in the wind. I mean, you can object if you disagree, but that's where we left off.
Yeah,
you're not allowed to object.
This is sat long enough. I feel like we might as well get it in. I wanted someone else to add the LGTM, but I guess maybe Shane tried and did. I don't know, but anyway, somebody should just LGTM it. Maybe I will.
I was intending to do it, and I am hopefully going to click that button later this evening.
Okay, awesome. So we're in a good spot with that. We looked at some of the open issues in the milestone for general HTTP support. Got 3 closed, 7 open. I've got a couple of these on the agenda for today. We're looking for owners to try to get some of these knocked out. The focuses here seem to be on routing and conformance. They've got a couple of PRs here for 2 of these, and then don't know if Nick is here. We should chat about an update to the policy attachment here. I don't know if policy attachment is blocking for this first 070.
I don't think it should be.
No, I agree. It shouldn't be.
Okay, cool. And
right.
the second and third ones on that list, I believe are both addressed by John's open PR. So there's I was as part of my review link them in, but I think those are both going to be resolved once that merges.
Yes. Okay. So I don't have permission to change this milestone, but the sounds of the action items to drop policy attachment for right now. And then we're thinking that John's PR wants to route per service limitation.
Yep,
Does John's
definitely.
PR address that?
It does.
Or is it okay? So I'll go ahead and while I am here.
Do you have the issue number handy for the milestone, the one that needs to change milestone?
For the milestone, the issue number is 1482.
Okay. And that's just not 070. We don't really care what milestone, just not 070.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
And then I will put 1479 here. Fixes 1479. So, okay, awesome.
It also
Love
fixes 1480.
1480. Yeah, it's already attached to 1480.
Oh, okay, okay, cool.
Cool. I don't see. Did I type it wrong? GitHub didn't do the thing. Interesting. Well, it's noted. So okay, we've got these 3 off PRs. This is actually this is actually, I'll save this for after the recap. Got a little bit into the weeds. So we talked about that. Again, our focus is on routing and conformance. We had a little bit of discussion on Istio's ambient model, and general architecture applicability, and then some interesting discussion that I've been processing in the background thread for a little while now about operator, like Kubernetes controller logic, and seeing if there is a way to create a common library or pattern for doing diffing and more performant updates as opposed to frequent reconciliation of the state of the world. So lots of fun stuff that we chatted about last week. Go ahead and add a topic for, I've got the milestone pruning there, so we'll tackle it there. So yeah, lots of interesting things we chatted about. Anybody have any questions or comments on the recap? All right, awesome. Rob, you've got the first formal agenda item of the meeting.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that I mentioned just briefly in the meeting yesterday was we're trying to figure out what we want to include in the next couple sets of Gateway API releases. One of the high level things we've been talking about a lot at the end of last year is we want to have more frequent releases that are smaller. So I don't want it to feel as, daunting if something like misses 070, because hopefully either 080 or 1.0 will be around the corner after that. We have a list of things that are mostly ingress focused that we want to, think about and move forward with from that other meeting. But I don't know. I'm just trying to figure out, what do we want to try and, commit to? What's the first release, artifacts for Gamma, really, the releasable artifacts. More of an open question. Shane's question is probably very relevant. Assuming somebody puts in a Contrib Summit talk, no, not a maintainer track talk, or there's maybe KubeCon talks already. Who knows? Whatever it is, what are we talking about in Amsterdam? That also seems very relevant to what we want to get in this next release.
I have thoughts, but I'll let other folks contribute first.
I think the key thing here is like, what do we want to show from Gamma? I think the larger, what do we want to show in the Gateway API question is one for another time.
I mean, I'm not even, I'm not the mesh expert, but I'll start trying to answer my own question by saying, a natural follow-up to what Nick said. It sure would be neat if we could demo a couple different mesh implementations implementing a baseline spec. That seems maybe achievable, but I'll defer to somebody more familiar.
I have a CFP in with, I forgot his name all of a sudden, but you recommended him to me, which would basically do just this.
Oh, Ray from Google.
Yeah, Ray, thank you.
Yeah, to me, like on the same line, like it's kind of a frustrating thing to say what we want to do next because I can't realistically go just make it happen. We can't just talk about it and come to an agreement. But it's like getting someone to actually go implement it. Aside from, as far as I know, it's still just Istio that has an implementation. And the moment there's conformance tests, will fill some of the edge cases. So it's kind of a hacky implementation. Because I feel like when we did it for Ingress, right off the bat, we had 3, 4, 5 implementations, and you learned a lot from having different implementations. We get users to try it out, give us feedback. We find out assumptions we made that aren't true across implementations. It's really the putting what we talked about into test. So without that, we're kind of in limbo. So it's hard for me as an Istio contributor to make other projects implement something, but if there's some way that I can help, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, it's definitely something that will not be ready in console by that point. It is something we definitely still want to do, but we have a bit more architecture work that kind of underpins some of this that we need to get to first. So.
Can I, so first of all, John, the good news is we have 2 implementation just in Istio itself. So we have the classic sidecar and we have the ambient-based implementation. So we can start with the implementation already and learn from it. But seriously speaking, I don't know about the other implementations, but most of them implement gateway, and waypoints are really gateways. So maybe a partial implementation where some elements of the mesh are implemented via, in gateways effectively. That may be desirable and compatible with Istio Ambient and probably benefit everyone, because I don't think the low-level Z tunnel or tunnel, whatever we are doing at the data plane to ensure security is that important. And the implementation on the waypoint is actually pretty close to the gateway implementation. It's not, just a bit of duct tape.
From Cilium's point of view, we won't have anything of Gamma stuff available for a while. I'm still busy sort of spinning up the service mesh team internally. So yeah, it's going to be a while to get everybody on board and sort of make it to a point where we can start consistently delivering. It is, however, 1,000% on the roadmap, just to be clear. All right.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like then we have kind of 2 paths forward. Is Linkerd comes and chimes in and says that they're going to save our predicament, or we blaze forward with 1 implementation as well, that's cost instead maybe 1.5, and hope that we can make progress with that. I mean, we certainly can do things like we can get conformance tests, we can get user feedback. It's just it's a bit risky that we end up making Istioisms sick. So I wouldn't feel very comfortable promoting it too far with 1. Well, I think it's actually a hard requirement listed somewhere, or if not, it should be of some number of implementations to promote. But maybe that's fine for experimental for now.
So I think there's a bit of a chicken egg problem here a bit, where, I mean, thankfully we've got people from a lot of implementations like here in this meeting who've been here for a while and know about Gamma and are looking to try to implement it. But on the other hand, one of the things that helps people here make justifications to the people who do the road mapping and stuff like that is, hey, customers are asking for this. And it's hard for customers to ask for a feature that's not released yet. And so I think there's a certain level of feedback that we'll get for as far as implementations go and getting customers to ask for this once it's released and once there's buzz about it. So there's that. I see something happening in the chat. Oh, interesting. So Kubernetes customer using Gateway API for AWS VPC Lattice. That is very interesting, Lee Wen. Do you have any more details you can share with us about timelines there?
I think right now we are in the private preview. So with the limited customers, and you have to talk to the account manager to get access. So that's why we have a POC, the Gateway API controller, but that's also in private repo. So hopefully by the GA, I think in the springtime, and I don't know exact date. There's we will put it up GA, and once the GA, we're going to open the GitHub repo, our controller implementation. So the Kubernetes customer can basically using Gateway API language to get the benefit of VPC lattice.
I don't know how private your private preview is exactly, but if even like sharing some docs or example config with some of the people here privately, if necessary, I think may be useful for everyone. Obviously, it's up to you, but I certainly would love to take a look and could give feedback or.
Sure. Yeah, I need to check with our PM, and yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that's super exciting. For what it's worth, from my POV, I think that pushing forward with only one implementation for experimental is probably fine. Again, it's difficult to get consensus among communities without something being definitively part of a release. So I would be fine with pushing forward even with just Istia's implementation. I do know that Linkerd has some feedback and some limitations about the current HTTP route service binding model. That Flynn said he'd be ready to share in the next couple of weeks. But in the meantime, I mean, I think that our strategies thus far has been to kind of to push forward to get things in people's hands. You know, Linkerd is one community. This is another community. OSM is another community, right? So as this percolates forward, we'll be able to go back and make the breaking changes that we need to, if that is necessary. So I'm not too worried about moving forward with what we've got now for 070. Any thoughts or disagreements?
I think one thing that may have gotten missed there, like it sounds like Kong Kuma may also have something presentable by KubeCon, so that
That's the
might also
intention,
help.
yeah. The intention is we already have an API for like HTTP in the same way that we're talking about HTTP route, and for Amsterdam, the hope, if that CFP goes through, would be to just add a compiler that compiles HTTP route to that, so that we can show HTTP route being used for that, even if it's semi-derived, but it should be, you know, just a good idea of like, here's what we're heading for with Gamma. Sorry, I don't feel great today, so if I sound terrible, it's because I feel terrible.
Feel better soon.
Yeah, I think that it's likely that whatever we do end up doing for Cilium will be something along those lines, that it'll be like a cross compilation thing where you take the service and the HTTP route and end up turning it into whatever the layer 7 routing policies we already have for some things anyway.
That's also what we do. So
And
for Ingress as well. So
similar for console, except that we're also in the process of updating some of our internal constructs to more closely map to HTTP route.
Well, I mean, and the good part is that if everyone is using that sort of approach, then if we do decide that we need to change directions, it's not a massive lift, right? Like, like we're changing our translators to translate different things into the same end result. So that sounds good to me. That is indicative to me that proceeding with only one sort of functional implementation right now is probably fine, especially for how experimental this is, because everyone else is going to be doing something similar to what the current to what Istio is doing. So we will find out if there are problems when we get to them. But if everyone's doing roughly similar things, then we shouldn't have someone like, oh, architecturally, I just can't do this.
But Nick, architecture, you're saying same thing at Istio, but as I mentioned, there are two Istios. Are you saying that you are following the H1 ambient model, or are you following the old sidecar model?
Whatever the one that John said would be able to get
Yeah,
working.
if I may, you're talking about two different things, Gaussen. He, I believe, just meant the fact that we translate to virtual service internally as implementation detail.
Oh, I see. So that part, yeah, it's implementation.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Yeah, is the fact that, you know, and probably the rest of us who are a bit further behind that is what we'll be doing, because almost everyone who has a service mesh has some way of doing this sort of thing, because that's like, you know, there's a reason why we did it first. It's the key thing. And so like we're going to be translating the common definitions into the specific thing that we have available wherever we can. That's all I was trying to say.
That's very reasonable, and I think for any existing implementation is the right thing to do, but for any new implementation or starting from scratch, probably it's worth starting straight with the new API. That's my feeling. And even Istio may at some point, hopefully, you know, after we clean up the sidecar.
All right, Rob, does that kind of give you, I'm starting to forget your original question, but does that kind of give you some idea of where folks are with 070?
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like if our end goal is we need to be able to demo something that we call Gamma, and, you know, ideally with more than one implementation at KubeCon, if that's what we're working towards, we need to include something in a gateway API release before then that defines what that is. Seems like 070 is that target. We've got a number of GEPs merging soon. Maybe we can just try and, maybe this has already been defined, but it seems like we need like a minimum viable set of GEPs in that are actually implementable. And I'm not sure what that is. Maybe it is what you're saying there. It is that milestone you were just looking at.
That's kind of how I've been proceeding. Like that's been my assumption. I think that anything beyond this would be too much investment at this point in a particular implementation, particular model. Which is one reason why I was completely on board with removing policy attachment. It feels too soon. So, and this is not that much. You've got PRs associated for 3 out of the 6, or I think this number is just not updated. Yeah, there you go. I can count, I promise. Yeah, we have PRs for 3 out of the 6 of these issues. So let's chat about conformance a bit. If I recall correctly, conformance is only required for the beta graduation. Is that correct?
So conformance tests, yes. In terms of, I think this is talking more widely about the fact that, you know, what conformance level are the Gamma GEPs, right? Like, you know, and so like technically these are going to be, the Gamma stuff is going to be implementation specific when we first write it down, right? Like, because it's experimental, it's, you know, we don't have any conformance tests, which doesn't meet any of the criteria we have for extended. So therefore, you know, like, therefore we should be clear that this stuff is implementation specific behavior now. We are working towards defining a standard, but they're currently, you know, it's like a very rough standard. It is a draft standard. Like, you know, like maybe that's the word, because that's the word that RFCs use. This is a draft, you know, this is a draft of the Gamma standard, not a final Gamma standard or something. Rather than using experimental or something else that has other meanings, we use the word draft.
I like that. I think that disambiguates a good bit of some of the confusion that might pop up when it comes to how weird this all is. So that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and put something about draft of the standard in there. and open a new tab. Just so I can remember that. I'll go back and update that this issue. When it comes to supporting testing mesh implementations, I feel like this could be pushed out of scope for 070.
100%.
Because again, that's a beta requirement.
I mean, I think
So-
if we want to start talking about how we would do it, that's cool. But like, I don't think it shouldn't be a requirement for 070. It should be we are going to talk about this and we are going to have a standard way of testing this. We will have conformance, but like having a conformance suite that you can run right now is a nice to have, but not required.
Sorry, one
Okay.
thing that I hate to throw a wrench in all of this. The last meeting yesterday, there was a doc that I shared, a proposal that would simplify and bring us down to 2 API versions. The idea of alpha or preview and a GA API version. That kind of condenses things and it raises the bar for both, including alpha. And I can't remember the specific details of that proposal, and we can adjust as we see needed. But I think the current state of that proposal would be to include at least some conformance tests as a prereq for even including something in the API. Every part of that proposal is open to discussion, but just if that's something like we want to push, we should, have that discussion on that proposal as well.
That's a great point. I confess I missed that part. I missed that part of the proposal.
There's probably some more nuance here. It is very hard to write conformance tests when you don't have an implementation. At the same time, if you write conformance tests and there's already multiple implementations, that's also very hard because in some cases you have to pick a winner between 2 implementations that chose different ways to interpret the spec.
Felt that a few times.
Yeah. So hard to get the timing right on this. But I think, John, you've had your hand for a while, so.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One, like, I think regardless of whether it's required or not for XYZ, like conformance testing is, in my mind, one of the very most important priorities, because we can write specs all we want. I'm sure that all of us are going to miss parts of it and do funky things because mesh is just so complicated, especially because none of us are building from the ground up. So we're all trying to translate. And there's a lot of complexity on the under layers. So I don't know. I feel like to some extent, Rob, like the Gamma is unique in that for any other feature, it's just one more incremental feature on top of Ingress kind of. And so it's fairly easy to add a conformance test. For mesh, it's harder because we don't have any of the infrastructure for mesh tests. So it's kind of unique. I'm not necessarily saying we should or shouldn't do one way or the other, but if we decided that we didn't want to, I think it's reasonable to have an exception for Gamma given the differences. So I don't know. To me personally, I don't want to slow things down too much, but I also do think conformance tests are super, super important. So maybe we decide, fine, we'll ship something without it, but I don't want to deprioritize it, certainly.
Lots and lots of hands. I believe it was Costin, then Nick, then Mike.
Okay, quickly. So Gamma CRs mostly are HTTP route. So I don't think that's a problem to add tests or whatever to them. But mesh, really, it's more about behaviors, about how DNS resolves and how do you refer to things and how, and for that, maybe we can break the problem into parts and first have agreements about how DNS will resolve. That's the most recent discussion and debate we had, or, similar behaviors, because mesh is really more about, do expose telemetry, what is the common ground, how should, 2 workloads in different clusters talk with each other, this kind of stuff. More like interop than API CR conformance tests. That's my opinion. Yes.
Okay, so I guess, yeah, what I should be clear that what I am saying is I think that the deliverable we should focus on for the Gateway API 070 release is a document that outlines what Gamma's intents, like basically a summary of the 2 GEPs or something like that that we've got, that outlines what Gamma's intents are, what is included in the current draft spec. And I think, like I said, draft is a carefully chosen word. And so such that to make it clear that we are announcing a draft spec that is implementable, and that, that then for the next release, because we're not talking a long release time frame here, that's when we look at saying, okay, now we've got a draft spec, there's enough there for people to implement. Therefore, now we expect people to implement it, and then we start the work to define a conformance test suite. I think the point that Mike made about having conformance profiles / suites, I 100% agree. There needs to be a separate suite for mesh conformance testing. It needs to be completely independent. It will use a lot of the same bits, but it needs to be a thing that you can run into separately to the sort of the ingress / main gateway API things. But I think the thing we need to focus on for today is that the deliverable for 070 is a document that outlines the draft Gamma spec. What, the fact that you can bind a HTTP route to a service, what that means, all the stuff that we talked about in those GEPs. That is in my mind, that's the deliverable for 070, and that's it. That's the only deliverable. This is a draft spec. It's implementable. That's it.
Mike, you were next, but I see you.
Sorry, I started talking about clicking the lower hand button, so on mute. Yeah, I like that. That sounds good to me. The intent of this issue was not necessarily to block on having all of that machinery available, but really just to come up with a strategy for defining how Gamma conformance fits into alpha, beta, if it goes away or not, GA, experimental versus standard channels, and just defining that. And I think that could literally be a paragraph in the document that you're talking about.
Yeah, agreed. So I think I'm next. I agree with everything that Nick just said. I think that the thing that would worry me about making conformance tests a requirement for Gamma specifically, kind of harkening back to what John said, is that I'm worried about marrying us to a particular implementation so early. Because right now, if we had to pivot to one of the alternatives considered that we talked about way back when, instead of buying the service, we could do that pretty easily because, new draft spec, right? There's nothing really attaching us to the service parent ref approach when it comes to code. But when it's like, we have to change conformance test for this, even if it's, just understanding how human beings work, once you've invested some work into into codifying it and writing a conformance test and having people conform it with it, it feels a bit more official than the support that we're intending for right now, I think. So I'm for that reason, I'm in favor of not including tests right now. But to kind of go back to Rob, your general proposal, I'm generally fine with raising the bar. Like once we do get a solid direction with Gamma, once we do get the direction solidified and have implementation feedback and whatever, then any new Gamma feature should have conformance tests from the beginning. I think that's a good habit, like to get the project into. I think right now is probably just very early for where Gamma is right now to enforce that. So I'll lower my hand. Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Let me just throw out one middle ground, maybe. Would it be possible to say we should have a framework, a design, a something that at least shows we are making progress towards conformance? I will feel better if we don't just completely ignore conformance, that we clearly have some momentum towards conformance tests, because like everyone is, I think, in agreement that it is an important thing. I can agree, okay, it's a big project, we may change rapidly, we don't want to slow ourselves down. I get those things. I just want to make sure that we are actually moving towards conformance. Yeah.
There's a doc that was shared in Sig Multicluster earlier today that I think is very similar to what we might want to deliver in terms of just a intended approach to conformance, a description of here are the expected behaviors that we want to cover under a conformance suite. And basically it's an intent of what this will look like, even though we don't have the code to go along with it yet. I think something like that feels like a reasonable middle ground. I can drop that in the notes.
Yeah, and I think that's a great idea, Mike. And I can provide a quick update on where I've been on 1340 with the mesh conformance test framework so far. So I think this is actually in the issue itself. We'd agreed to kind of use, Istio's Echo client server and package it into for Gateway API and use that framework for mesh conformance tests. The person working on that from the Istio end could no longer do that, so I've been trying to navigate my way through the code. Hasn't gone super great, mostly because the Echo test framework is a bit complicated. And I see John smiling, maybe because I'm just missing something obvious or because it actually is complicated. Can't tell.
No, it's really complicated.
Yeah, so I'm doing a lot of refactoring and trying to balance it. It's one reason why I wanted to kind of figure out what the just clarify that tests are required for beta only. But I can try to bump that priority a little bit on my end, time management wise, and at least maybe push what I have. It's really just a bunch of renaming and figuring out the right Go package structure to get everything to compile. It's easy to include too much, then they go from like trying to strip it down. But there is progress being made on it. It's just a lot of refactoring work. Nick, sorry, you still have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yes. So no, I actually put it down, put it back up again. So yeah, I have just been thinking about this while we all talked. I think that the right place for the draft spec that I'm talking about is GEP 1426, which is John has the PR open to add some additional stuff to that. I hit the approve button on that while the meeting was happening. It looks like it GitHub says there's a conflict there. So John, you might need a rebase or something there, but once that's in, then I think if there's another PR down the bottom of this branch has conflicts. If there's another PR to add like a section that says, conformance testing, that basically says, makes the points, there will be a separate, conformance test suite. This conformance test suite will be built using the test client and blah, blah, just a bunch of points like that says, this is what the conformance tests are going to look like. Then we can kind of say, okay, look, we've got a plan. We're not doing this hard-cocked. There is a plan to do that. We don't have to do it yet. We just need to have a plan for doing it. And that's really what the point of a draft spec like this is, to say, here is a draft spec. We have a plan for taking it further, but here's the draft spec so that we're publishing this so that we can be clear that it is a real thing. And that way, we mark the gap as a like implementable, but like draft. We don't have a way to sort of communicate that in the status. I don't think we put it as implementable, but we mark that it is a draft. It is a proposal, like it is an implementable proposal that we expect people to try out and see. That in my mind, that means we've already done most of the work to sort of write down the behavior that we want. That is effectively the spec right now. So adding on to that seems like the least amount of work. And then we have the good part for that is that if we as the broader Gateway API community do decide that we want API reviewers to review something, we can say, by the way, while you're doing an API review, can you have a look over this gap, please, until give us initial impressions. I don't know if that's the right call or not, but then there is a singular artifact that we can point them at. That's the key. But I think to be honest, I think the only real thing to do there is to make sure that the language reflects what I just talked about, and to add the section on conformance. So there's actually not a lot to do.
Yeah, there is.
Sorry, I shouldn't assume that.
I don't disagree with the plan. I think, some of the language around 1426 has to change. I also feel like 1426 is already pretty long.
I mean, it is
I
a
guess it's
spec.
not that's fair. That there's inherent limit to readability as fair enough. Fair enough. I'll take that. But there is one other, and this is the topic that I have on the agenda. So I'm going to introduce it and then let other people add other things before I go down this rabbit hole. But there is one other thing I'd like to see in 1426 before we like move it to draft spec status or like RFC status, which is this top issue. But before that, any other comments on Nick's idea?
I mean, I propose lazy consensus here. If you, this is a, speak now or forever hold your peace kind of deal.
Yeah, I was just about to say that. I think that's where we are on this. Going once, twice, and sold. All right, get 1426 it is. Cool. So I think this conformance test plan, whoops, will just be, oh, and there we go. It is 1426, and we're just gonna do that. Awesome. Thanks for, I think that's Mike. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for writing notes as always. Cool. So I'm gonna pivot into this next topic. Is I think this probably should belong in 070 because it's probably an area of a lot of potential confusion for folks implementing the spec. We started talking about this is like right around KubeCon season, so it's no surprise to me that kind of what happened to it. But we started talking about disambiguating how gateways, like the ingress side of gateway API, should interact with gamma routing configuration. There is a draft of the proposal that was started, and again, the KubeCon happened, and I completely forgot this existed. I think Mike and John collaborated on this, or maybe Mike, you just did it. But I think this is pretty important to get through in our initial GEP because it's really codifying the ways that the existing thing and the new thing should interact. There are a couple of comments that are unresolved. I kind of want to bring this back to the forefront for folks to discuss in like the 10-15 minutes we have left.
So, do you want to go first, Mike?
Sure. 2 sentences. This could probably become a paragraph in the existing GEP rather than.
You've become really quiet for me.
Oh, sorry. This could possibly become a paragraph in the existing GEP rather than its own entire thing, and is already touched on by John's pending PR. In terms of how it defines the relation of consumer routes to producer routes, it similarly defines the relationship of gateway routes to producer routes, basically following the TLDR from this. But yeah, we should resolve it and get things wrapped up here.
So yeah, I agree. Looking further down the document, the idea of moving host names inside HTTP route. So that is breaking API change. That would mean that HTTP route would need to move to v2 alpha 1 and go back to alpha. That is a polite way of saying, tell him he's dreaming, to use an Australianism. So like, I don't, while that is a nice way to solve this problem, I do not think it is practical. Like it's not practical to do in sort of any reasonable amount of time because it is a breaking API change, massively breaking, by the way. So yeah, I don't think that proposal is workable. It's too big a change to the API at this point in the existing API's lifecycle. Could we end up with a mesh route or something like that added that in? Totally. But like the existing HTTP route is not changeable easily at this point without significant impact. should we make it so that we call out the interaction like as John has done? I think yeah, absolutely. That's a complete no-brainer. It needs to be very clear what happens if you have a HTTP route targeting a service that is also a backend for another HTTP route, right? Like that behavior needs to be clarified as part of the spec. And it's 100% fine for the existing answer, which is nothing happens, right? Like that's fine. Like, but it just needs to have an answer. Yeah, I just wanted to be clear that, that the proposal of moving hostnames field, like, I don't see it happening in any time in the future without a major version bump to the API. Sorry, API guarantees are a hell of a drug.
I'll reread this more closely, but right now I think in Gamma, we recommend or say that you must not infer anything from the host names field in HTTP route. Basically, like with the intent of like, it's not useful. It's possible that we don't have to remove it from that, but potentially consider adding it to parent reference and defining the interaction between the two. It's a path to explore that I think would not require the breaking API change. I can take another look at this.
That's an additive change, so we could conceivably do it. Interactions could get extremely complex though, because
it could. I don't know
already got
if
a free
it's the benefit is worth the
comparison.
complexity.
Adding an extra layer in there is going to be wolf.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah, and just to sound the technical details of this, I think that most of the need for this is to enable things like using one HTTP route for multiple host names, and for gateway and for mesh. And the other option is to just create separate HTTP routes. And while yes, that is non-zero burden on the user, I want to acknowledge that. It's also allows us to not make a breaking change to a spec, and make things very explicit. So it's a trade-off that I'm probably fine with. But to Nick's point, we just need to make sure we clarify this in the GEP.
I think one of the things I want to agree with what you're saying, and I think one of the things that we have been thinking but not saying very clearly is Gateway API is probably best used with more smaller resources than a lot of large resources. And that kind of goes along with what you're saying. Although you could make a very large HTTP route, I think in general, we'd recommend against that. That's probably something like we should document. That's just something like that I think at least I have been thinking, and I think that's come up in conversations before as well. So I would just kind of use that same train of thought to say, maybe we should avoid these really complex scenarios where you can do all the things in a single HTTP route. Not saying there can't be some overlap, but when it starts to get really complex like this, we should probably just say it shouldn't work.
I think the thing I was going to say is the thing that you're trying to model here with the parent refs having host names, you can actually model today without making a change because the host names is a list and there is an implied host name in a service. So like you don't actually need to make a change to be able to model the thing that you're talking about. If you included all three of those names in the host name thing, the host name matching semantics say at least one has to match, not all have to match. So like it could work. That said, I agree with Rob. We definitely are. The API is built in such a way that we have expected that people will generally use more smaller objects rather than larger ones. That's one of the reasons for the many limits on the lists, aside from the fact that there are, having limits on lists is just good design practice. That we have actually had a request already to increase the limits on some of the lists because someone was auto-generating HTTP routes for ingress from a Swagger definition. So I actually have an outstanding to-do item to write some documentation that says, if you are going to auto-generate routes from Swagger, then we recommend you do it this way. Basically, each endpoint should be a separate HTTP route is the TLDR there. But there's a few other cases like that I expect will be common. That was the main point I wanted to make. But yeah, I just also realized that what you're trying to model there does not require any changes to the spec currently. Whether or not we should prohibit that, well, that's a different discussion. Costin, you're up.
Yeah, just quickly, I raised this before. As an application developer creating a Helm chart, the last thing I want to do is to put custom host names and customization for HTTP routes that are typically bundled with the application with whatever host names and mesh names are going to be used. So I think it's a bad practice in general to have any host name in HTTP routes, and should be avoided as a best practice by everyone. Which the host name should be defined in the gateway and DNS entries or whatever else is outside of the application developer power to control. So I think it's a moot problem.
Okay. I have a puzzle about this host name. It's mainly the certificates. As a service owner, I want to define my own certificate. I do not want like my certificate managed by SDO or AWS, and I do have my own search system, and I want to specify a search along with the a name, a host name. And if we remove it's a puzzle to me. If we remove the host name, how do I associate, as a service owner, how do I associate my search to express this is the host name I want to use, and I have a search signed using this host name. And if we remove the host name, how do we do that?
So that in the Ingress use case, that is what the hostname field is for. That sort of thing is why there is a hostname in the HTTP route. As Costin said in the chat, the cert, there's no place to hook a cert onto a HTTP route because we wanted the TLS stuff needs to be hooked to a listener on the gateway for Ingress. And so the intent there is that the certs live at the gateway and you have a listener that has that cert attached and have the host name on the gateway that matches the cert. And that's where you do the host name and the cert matching is on the listener level at the gateway level. And then, that's for whether or not you're terminating, if you're terminating, right? But if you're not, if you're doing the thing that you're talking about where you have a client, like a serving cert inside the pod that you're talking about, that's actually the thing that we're talking about in the upstream thing with the, you can roughly call it re-encrypt, although that's not 100% correct. Like where the gateway acts as the gateway's data plane acts as a TLS client, and like talks TLS to the backend service. That is a little bit orthogonal to what we're talking about here, because because in all of those cases, the host name is only an indicator for the data plane about where the traffic should be routed. The data plane is not expected to like unwrap the cert and have a look at the cert and check that the sands on the cert match the host name. So like that is explicitly not required. Yeah. Sorry.
Imagine, what if my data plane is doing that? Let's say imagine I have a ambient fleet, to use the ambient as an example. And I'm now using the SDO certificate authority. I want the customer, they want to bring their own cert, what if that's the case? It's the proxy fleet, it's intercepting, using the customer own cert, and which contain the name of the HTTP routes. And how do I do that? I think that's my confusion. Try to wrap my head around it. Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I think to be honest, without seeing the doc on what you guys are doing in VPC Lattice, I think it's hard to answer that question, because I think what you guys are doing is different than what anyone else here is doing. Like for the mesh case, we had already established previously that mesh TLS or IPsec or WireGuard or whatever mesh is used for identity is outside of scope, right? That's a mesh specific concern, and it doesn't need to be represented in the API. Now, it's possible that you have a different use case that we didn't consider, but it's hard to, for me at least, talk about it more without understanding that more clearly.
Okay.
Sorry, can I just jump in there? You mentioned TLS use cases. That is what that TLS use cases doc is for. Let me just put a link to it in the chat. And then Keith, you can keep talking. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's I was going towards that TLS use case, Doc Nick. What you're describing, Leewin, feels at least like picking the dots in my head, assuming I'm on your implementation. It sounds like that particular use case is one of the downsides of our current API with binding HTTP route service, because it creates it makes service HTTP route one-to-one, where typically it hasn't been in the ingress use case. The service, how do I describe it? My words are escaping me. Basically, with meshy things or with encryption things, there is a layer that is missing in Kubernetes, and that's what the backend properties get. The TLS use cases, all that is seeking to try to describe. And for mesh, it's kind of transparent, right? Because you've got sidecar proxies that are handling, or not necessarily sidecars, but you've got things, proxies, network devices that are doing that work, distributing those certificates and doing that stuff for you in the background. And Kubernetes doesn't have to think about it. It was kind of by design. But without something orchestrating that transparently, it's really difficult to represent what you're describing in Kubernetes, because it's just not, historically hasn't been one of the priority use cases, at least from my perspective. Go ahead, Costin, though we are right.
No, I put in comments. I think we need to maybe next time to start discussing DNS and naming, because certificates, I mean, in general, it's not your business to control what, most of the time users don't want to mess with DNS or don't understand TLS and all those things. Normally, you expect a name in the DNS that you resolve as a client to be resolved to something you put in an SNI header, to be automatically mapped to a certificate, which is validated to have a SAN with that particular name. So usually the opportunities to, any opportunity to customize this is basically confusing, creating security problems and complexity, and for people who typically don't understand what they're doing. So as in Istio in particular, we do this by putting the service account and namespace. Most people on the internet doing by using DNS SANs, which again, if we have a stable scheme, we agree on about how to name things, and it can be implemented in the DNS, and then arbitrary clients will work unmodified. But in general, the least amount we put in the API and the more we leave us using the standards, the better it is for everyone, if I make any sense, because anything TLS related doesn't make sense usually.
I don't disagree there. I'm going to go ahead and cap the discussion for respect to everybody's time. But it was useful and riveting as always. Hopefully we can continue to push this forward and talk about this a bit more next week. Again, if this conversation triggers something for you that you want to discuss, please put it on our agenda for next week. And I'll see all of you later. Take care.
Thanks.
Thanks. See ya.